The fire spread across the colony like a living thing, hungry and wild, consuming everything the humans had built over 3 generations, and Warlord Vakris watched it all from the bridge of his warship with a smile that showed too many teeth, and his forearms crossed over his massive chest in satisfaction, because this was what he did best, what his people had done for centuries across the stars, taking what they wanted from whoever was too weak to stop them. And these humans were definitely too weak to stop anything. The planet below was called New Haven, and it had been home to 3 million humans just yesterday. But today it belonged to the Kralthan Empire, and the humans who survived were running or hiding or dying, and none of those options would save them. In the end, because Vakris never left survivors who might fight back later, and his warriors were thorough in their work, moving through the cities and towns with weapons that turned buildings into dust and people into memories. Commander Helrix approached his leader with a datapad in his clawed hands, and his tail swishing back and forth the way it did when he was pleased with the results of their conquest, and he reported that the human defenders had put up almost no resistance worth mentioning. Just a few scattered groups of soldiers who tried to hold their positions but broke and ran when the real firepower started, and even their military bases had been captured within hours of the first landing. Vakris laughed, and the sound echoed through the bridge loud enough to make his crew look up from their stations, because they knew that laugh meant their commander was happy, and when Vakris was happy the rewards flowed freely to his warriors, but when he was angry the punishments were swift and brutal, and everyone on board the Decimator had seen both sides of their warlord's mood, and they much preferred the laughing version. The human military forces on New Haven had been led by a captain named Jake Morrison, and he had tried his best with the few hundred soldiers under his command. But trying was not the same as winning, and Morrison's forces had been pushed back again and again until they retreated into the mountains with nothing but their personal weapons and whatever supplies they could carry on their backs. And Morrison kept sending messages asking for help from the main human fleet, but no help came, because the fleet was far away near Earth doing nothing useful. Vakris ordered his communications officer to record a message, and he stood straight and tall with his armor gleaming under the bridge lights. And he spoke directly to the human leaders on Earth, with words that dripped with contempt because he wanted them to know exactly how little he thought of their species and their pathetic attempts at defending themselves against a superior force. The message was simple and direct, because Vakris believed in clarity when dealing with inferior species, and he told the humans they had one choice, and only one choice if they wanted to avoid total destruction. And that choice was complete surrender of all their territories and all their resources and all their pride, because the Kralthan Empire did not negotiate with equals, only with servants and slaves, and the humans would learn to be grateful for the mercy of serving rather than dying. He gave them 10 days to respond, and then he ordered his fleet to move to the next target, because sitting still was boring, and there were more human colonies to conquer and more fires to light across their territory, and each victory would make the next one easier, because fear spreads faster than fire. When people realize their protectors cannot protect them, and their weapons cannot harm their enemies, and their prayers to whatever gods they worship go unanswered in the cold emptiness of space. The next colony fell in 2 days, and the one after that in less than a day, and Vakris kept count because he liked numbers and statistics and records, and he wanted to be remembered as the warlord who conquered humanity faster than any species had been conquered before, and at this rate he would reach Earth itself within a month, and the humans would surrender or die, and either way the Kralthan Empire would grow larger, and his name would be written in the history files as a great commander. But Captain Morrison was still alive in the mountains of New Haven, and he was not running anymore because running only delayed the inevitable, and he was not hiding because hiding was the same as giving up, and Morrison had never been good at giving up, even when giving up was the smart choice and the logical choice and the choice that would keep him alive for a few more days. Instead, he gathered his surviving soldiers around him in a cave deep in the wilderness where the Kralthan sensors could not find them, and he looked at their faces and saw fear but also anger and determination, because these were professional soldiers who had taken oaths to defend their people, and those oaths did not come with exceptions for when the enemy was too strong or too numerous or too advanced in their technology. Morrison told his people they were going to fight back, and some of them looked at him like he was crazy, because fighting back against an enemy that had crushed their entire defensive force in hours seemed like suicide. But Morrison explained that Winning was not always about big battles and grand victories, and sometimes winning was about making the enemy pay a price for every meter of ground they took and every building they occupied, and every day they stayed on human soil. He divided his forces into small teams and gave each team a specific mission, and he told them to strike fast and disappear faster, and to never stand and fight when they could run and live to strike again, because the Kralthans might have better weapons and better armor and better ships, but they did not have better knowledge of this terrain, and they did not have the motivation that comes from defending your home against invaders who want to take everything from you. The teams moved out under cover of darkness, and they hit Kralthan supply convoys and ammunition depots and communication relays, and every time they struck, they sent a message back to Morrison with details about what they learned and what they saw and how the enemy operated, and Morrison compiled all that information and sent it in encrypted bursts to any human forces that might be listening, because information was a weapon too, and sometimes the most powerful weapon of all. On Earth, the human government met in emergency sessions that lasted days, and the debates were fierce, because some wanted to surrender immediately to save lives, and others wanted to fight even if fighting meant dying, and the arguments went in circles while the Kralthan fleet moved closer to the core worlds where billions of humans lived their lives unaware that everything might change in the next few weeks. President Ellen Carter listened to all the arguments and all the proposals and all the fear and anger and desperation in the room. But she kept looking at one person who had not spoken much during the debates, and that person was Admiral Peter Hayes, who commanded the entire human military fleet, and when she finally asked him directly what he thought should be done, he gave her an answer that surprised everyone in the room. Hayes said he needed time, and Carter asked how much time, and he said 7 days, and someone pointed out that 7 days would mean more colonies lost and more people killed, and Hayes acknowledged that was true, but he said losing a few more colonies now might save humanity as a whole later, and the room erupted in protests, but Carter held up her hand for silence and asked Hayes if he had a plan, and he said yes, and she asked if it would work, and he said he believed it would, and she made her decision right there. The human government sent a response to Vakris asking for negotiations and discussions and diplomatic meetings to work out the terms of a possible arrangement, and Vakris read the message and laughed again because he knew exactly what the humans were doing, and they were stalling for time, but he could not figure out why they needed time when their fleet was doing nothing, and their colonies were falling one after another, and their military seemed paralyzed by indecision. But Vakris was feeling generous because victory was so close he could taste it, and he decided to let the humans have their time, because watching them squirm and beg was entertaining, and it would make the final surrender even sweeter when it came. And besides, his warriors needed rest and resupply after conquering so many worlds in such a short time, and a few days of rest would make them even more effective when they moved against the core systems. Commander Helrix asked if letting the humans delay was wise, and Vakris told him that wisdom was knowing when you had already won, and mercy was allowing the defeated to accept their defeat with dignity, and the humans were defeated. They just did not know it yet, but they would learn soon enough, and then the Kralthan Empire would span from one side of this sector to the other, and no species would dare challenge them again. The Kralthan warships moved through human space like sharks through water, and everywhere they went they left destruction behind them. But Warlord Vakris was beginning to notice something strange about the humans and their response to his conquest, and the strangeness was that there seemed to be no real response at all, just more requests for talks and negotiations and discussions about terms and conditions and diplomatic protocols, and all of it felt like empty words designed to waste time, but time for what he could not understand. Commander Helrix brought him reports every day about the human fleet, and every day the report said the same thing, and that thing was nothing, because the human fleet was not moving and not preparing for battle and not even reinforcing the colonies that still remained free from Kralthan control, and the largest battle group under Admiral Hayes just sat there near Earth doing absolutely nothing while colonies burned and people died, and Vakris kept expecting them to do something, but they never did. The Kralthan scouts sent detailed information about human ship positions, and there were about 200 warships total divided into 3 main groups, and the biggest group had maybe 90 ships under Hayes' command, and they were all parked around the solar system in defensive positions, but they were not moving outward to intercept the Kralthan advance, and they were not even conducting training exercises or patrol routes, and it was like watching a military force that had already given up before the real fight even started. Vakris called a meeting with his senior officers, and he asked them what they thought about the human behavior. And some said the humans were cowards, and others said the humans were in shock from losing so many colonies so quickly, and a few suggested that maybe the humans were planning something, but when pressed to explain what that something might be, they had no answers because the evidence suggested the humans were doing nothing at all, except talking. The tactical officer pointed out that human communications had increased dramatically, and there were encrypted messages flying back and forth between Earth and the outer colonies, and between different fleet groups, and between military installations, all over human space, but the encryption was too strong to break quickly. And besides, all that communication did not change the fact that no human ships were moving to engage the Kralthan fleet, and no defensive preparations were visible, and no traps were being set, at least none that Kralthan sensors could detect. On Earth, Admiral Hayes stood in the command center surrounded by holographic displays that showed every ship and every colony, and every piece of the vast puzzle he was trying to solve. And his staff watched him with expressions that mixed faith and doubt, because they trusted their admiral. But they also saw the reports of colonies falling and civilians dying, and they wondered if any plan could be worth such a high cost in lives and suffering. Commander Lisa Grant was Hayes' second in command, and she had served with him for 15 years, and she knew him better than most people, and she could see the strain on his face even though he tried to hide it, because every colony that fell was a weight on his conscience, and every civilian death was a name he would remember. But he never wavered from his plan, because wavering meant doubt, and doubt meant failure, and failure meant the end of everything. Grant approached Hayes quietly when the command center was less crowded, and she asked him if he was certain about this strategy, and he looked at her with tired eyes and said that certainty was a luxury they could not afford, but probability was on their side, and the Kralthans were behaving exactly as he predicted they would, and every day they pushed deeper into human space was another day they walked further into the trap. Hayes explained that the Kralthan Empire had conquered 17 other species before encountering humanity, and every one of those conquests had followed the same pattern, with overwhelming force applied quickly to break the enemy's will. And then, occupation and subjugation, and the Kralthans had never faced an enemy that refused to play by those rules, and they had never encountered a species that was willing to sacrifice pieces to win the whole game. The plan was simple in concept but brutal in execution, and it required the human government to accept losses that would make people angry and afraid, and it required the military to sit still while civilians suffered, and it required perfect timing, because if they moved too soon the Kralthans would escape, and if they moved too late the Kralthans would be too spread out to trap effectively, and the window of opportunity was narrow and closing with every day that passed. President Carter gave regular addresses to the human population, trying to keep morale up, while also preparing them for the hard truth that more colonies would fall before the situation improved, and some people believed her, and others thought the government had already given up, and there were protests on Earth and Mars and Europa demanding action. But Carter held firm because she trusted Hayes, and because the alternative was to fight a conventional war against an enemy with more experience and better technology, and that war would end with humanity enslaved or extinct. In the occupied colonies, the resistance cells continued their guerrilla campaigns, and Captain Morrison had become something of a legend among the fighters, because he seemed to be everywhere at once, striking at Kralthan supply lines, and then disappearing. Before reinforcements could arrive, and his teams were gathering valuable intelligence about Kralthan tactics and equipment and command structures, and all that information flowed back to Hayes, who absorbed every detail like a man studying for the most important test of his life. Morrison sent a message to Hayes directly using a secure channel that took 3 days to establish, and in that message he described how the Kralthans operated on the ground, and how they were overconfident to the point of carelessness, and how they did not bother with proper security protocols because they assumed the humans were beaten, and Morrison said that overconfidence was a weakness that could be exploited if someone was smart enough and ruthless enough to use it against them. Hayes responded with a single line that said, "Keep them busy and keep them confident," and Morrison understood what that meant, and he intensified his operations to make sure the Kralthans saw the resistance as nothing more than annoying insects that could be swatted away eventually, and not as a serious threat to their occupation, and the Kralthans fell for it, because they had seen this pattern before on other worlds, where conquered populations fought back briefly before accepting their new reality. The days passed and the diplomatic communications continued, and the humans kept asking for face-to-face meetings and detailed discussions about exactly what terms of surrender would look like. And Vakris grew more amused with each request because the humans were so transparent in their delaying tactics, but he let them play their game because he was in no hurry, and his fleet needed time to resupply, and his warriors needed rest, and the colonies they had taken needed to be secured before pushing on to Earth. On the 6th day of the deadline, Vakris had said President Carter sent another message, and this message said that humanity was ready to discuss unconditional surrender, and the only request was that the discussions happen in person so that both sides could see each other and understand that this was a serious commitment to peace. And Vakris read the message 3 times because he could not believe the humans were actually giving up without forcing him to take Earth itself. Vakris called Helrix to his chambers and showed him the message and asked if it could be a trap. And Helrix analyzed every word and every implication, and finally said that it seemed legitimate because the humans had nothing to gain from a trap, when their fleet was still sitting motionless and their colonies were already lost, and their military had shown no ability to match Kralthan firepower. And besides, what kind of trap could possibly work against a fleet of 90 warships backed by the most powerful empire in this region of space? The Warlord decided to accept the human surrender offer, but he made conditions of his own, and he said the meeting would happen on Riverside Colony, which was one of the worlds he currently occupied, and the humans would come to him, and not the other way around, and they would have one day to arrive, and if they tried anything clever, he would order his fleet to burn every human colony between Riverside and Earth and turn billions of people into ash and dust. President Carter received the message and immediately called Hayes and asked if this was the moment they had been waiting for. And Hayes looked at his tactical displays and ran calculations in his head and checked the positions of every Kralthan ship and every human ship. And then he smiled for the first time in days and said, yes, this is exactly what we needed. And now it was time to spring the trap. Hayes sent orders to every human ship in the fleet, and the orders were simple and direct. And they said to begin Operation Hammer immediately, and to maintain communication silence until the operation was complete, and to trust that every piece of the plan would come together at the right moment. And the ship captains read their orders, and many of them felt their hearts race because they had been waiting for this moment for days, and now finally they would get to fight back. The human ships that had been sitting still for so long suddenly came to life, and their engines powered up and their weapons systems went active, and they began moving, but not toward the Kralthan fleet and not toward. Warlord Vakris stood in the main hall of the governor's mansion on Riverside Colony, and the building showed damage from the fighting that had taken place when his forces captured the world, but it still served as an adequate symbol of his conquest, and he was preparing to receive President Carter and accept her surrender in person, and the thought made him feel satisfied, because this would be his greatest victory, and the moment that would define his legacy as a conqueror. Commander Helrix entered the room quickly, and his expression was different from usual, and there was something in his eyes that Vakris had rarely seen in all their years of fighting together, and that something looked uncomfortably like fear. And Helrix reported that their sensors were detecting unusual energy readings across multiple sectors, and the readings had appeared suddenly and without warning, and they did not match any known patterns in the Kralthan database. Vakris asked what kind of energy readings, and Helrix said they were massive power signatures, consistent with large numbers of ships. But the signatures were different from the human ships they had been tracking, and they were more powerful by an order of magnitude, and they had appeared in 6 different locations simultaneously, as if they had materialized from nowhere, and the scout ships were trying to get better readings, but preliminary counts suggested hundreds of contacts, not dozens. Before Vakris could respond, every alarm in the mansion started blaring, and the same alarms were going off on every Kralthan ship in orbit, and the tactical displays lit up with red markers, showing new contacts surrounding their position, and the contacts were closing in from all directions in a coordinated pattern that spoke of careful planning and perfect execution. And Vakris felt his confidence crack for the first time since beginning this campaign. He ran from the mansion toward the landing pad where his shuttle waited, and he screamed orders into his communicator for his ship to prepare for immediate departure, and all Kralthan vessels to go to battle stations and form defensive positions. But the orders came too late because the human fleet was already in position and had weapons locked onto every Kralthan ship, and the trap had been sprung before Vakris even realized there was a trap. The shuttle lifted off and raced toward the decimator in orbit, and Vakris watched through the viewport as hundreds of human warships hung in space around Riverside like a net made of metal and fire. And these were not the ships that had been sitting near Earth doing nothing, and these ships were bigger and sleeker and bristled with weapons that made Kralthan plasma cannons look like primitive tools. And Vakris understood in that moment that he had been deceived and manipulated and led into a killing zone. On the bridge of the Liberty, Admiral Hayes watched the tactical display with satisfaction, and every piece was in place, and every ship was exactly where it needed to be, and the Kralthan fleet was surrounded with no avenue of escape and commander. Grant reported that all ships were ready to fire on his command, and the trap was complete and perfect, and now it was time to see if Vakris was smart enough to surrender or stupid enough to fight. Hayes opened a communication channel to the Kralthan flagship, and his image appeared on screens throughout the Decimator's bridge, and he identified himself as the commander of the human fleet, and he told Vakris that the Kralthan forces were surrounded and outgunned, and he was offering one opportunity to surrender peacefully and withdraw from human space without further bloodshed, and his tone was calm and professional and carried no hint of anger or hatred, just cold military pragmatism. Vakris stared at Hayes through the view screen, and his shock transformed into rage because he had been tricked and humiliated and made to look like a fool, and his mandibles clicked rapidly in agitation, and he demanded to know where these ships had come from and how the humans had hidden an entire fleet from Kralthan sensors, and what kind of treachery had been used to lure him into this position. Hayes explained with patience that would have been admirable in other circumstances, that the Kralthan scouts had been tracking decoy vessels, not the real human fleet, and the real fleet had taken a longer route through unmapped space, using experimental, faster-than-light drives that left no conventional signatures, and while Vakris had been watching phantom ships, the actual human military had been moving into position and waiting for him to concentrate his forces in one vulnerable location. The Admiral leaned forward and said that Vakris had made assumptions about humanity, based on limited data, from encounters with colonial defense forces, and he had never actually fought the human military at full strength, and that oversight was about to cost him everything. And Hayes said that the diplomatic delays and surrender offers had all been part of the plan to buy time and position forces and make Vakris confident enough to gather his fleet where it could be surrounded. Vakris roared that the Kralthan Empire had conquered 17 species, and their shields had never been breached, and their weapons had torn through every defense they ever encountered, and he would not be defeated by primitives who barely knew how to build proper starships, and he cut the communication channel and ordered his fleet to attack formation, and told every captain to target the human command vessel and show these upstart humans what true military power looked like. The Kralthan fleet opened fire, and 90 warships unleashed everything they had, and plasma bolts and missiles streaked toward the human vessels. And for a moment it seemed like the sheer volume of fire might overwhelm the defenders. But then the human ships activated their shields, and the Kralthan weapons hit those shields and dissipated harmlessly like rain hitting stone, and the Kralthans stared in disbelief, because their weapons had never failed them before. Hayes received a damage report from his tactical officer, and the officer reported that shields were at 97%, and the Kralthan weapons were barely making an impact. And Hayes nodded and gave the order for all human ships to return, fire with instructions to disable enemy vessels rather than destroy them, because he wanted prisoners, not corpses, and the human fleet opened up with railguns that accelerated projectiles to a fraction of light speed. The railgun rounds punched through Kralthan's shields like they were not even there, and tore into hulls with devastating effect and targeted enemy engines and weapon systems with precision that came from weeks of planning and analysis, and within minutes a dozen Kralthan ships were drifting powerless in space, and their crews were alive, but their vessels were crippled and useless, and more ships were being disabled with every passing moment. Vakris watched his fleet being torn apart, and he could not understand how this was happening, because Kralthan technology was supposed to be superior, and Kralthan warriors were supposed to be unbeatable, and yet here they were being destroyed by a species they had dismissed as weak and primitive, and the cognitive dissonance made him feel like his mind was breaking, because everything he believed about his empire and his military was being proven wrong in real time. Commander Helrix checked his instruments frantically and reported that human weapons technology was far more advanced than intelligence had suggested, and their shields operated on principles that Kralthan scientists did not understand, and their tactical coordination was perfect, as if they had planned for this exact scenario and practiced it 1,000 times. And Helric said that the humans had not just gotten lucky, they had prepared specifically to counter Kralthan strengths and exploit Kralthan weaknesses. Hayes spoke again on the open channel, and his voice cut through the chaos of battle, and he said that humans had been watching the Kralthan Empire for 3 years and studying every battle and analyzing every tactic and learning from every species that had fallen to Kralthan conquest, and humanity had used that time to build a fleet designed specifically to defeat Vakris and his forces, and the admiral said that the Kralthans had made the mistake of fighting the same war over and over, while humans had prepared to fight a new kind of war. Vakris ordered his remaining ships to concentrate all fire on the Liberty, and he would destroy Hayes and his flagship, even if it cost him his entire fleet, and dozens of Kralthan vessels converged on the human command ship and unleashed a storm of plasma and missiles that lit up space like a small sun, and for a few seconds the Liberty's shields flared brilliantly under the concentrated assault. But the rest of the human fleet moved to protect their flagship, and destroyers and cruisers positioned themselves between the Kralthans and their target, forming a defensive wall that absorbed the incoming fire and fighter craft launched from carrier vessels and swarmed the Kralthan ships like angry insects, targeting weapons and engines with small but precise attacks that added up to devastating damage, and the Kralthan formation broke apart under the coordinated assault. Deep in the mountains of Riverside, Captain Morrison had been monitoring Kralthan communications from his hidden base, and when he learned that Vakris had landed on the planet, he saw an opportunity that was too good to miss, and he gathered his team and told them they were going to do something crazy and dangerous and probably suicidal. But if it worked, they might turn the tide of the battle happening in orbit above them. Morrison led his Marines in a raid on the Kralthan command post that Vakris had established in the governor's mansion, and the Kralthans had pulled most of their ground forces up to their ships when the battle. The silence that followed Vakris' surrender was strange and heavy, and it filled the space around Riverside Colony like something physical that pressed down on everyone who experienced it. And on the bridge of the Liberty, Admiral Hayes let out a breath he had been holding for what felt like days, and Commander Grant looked at him with an expression that mixed relief and exhaustion, because they had won, but the cost had been high, and the work was far from finished. Hayes gave orders to secure all Kralthan vessels and take their crews into custody, and provide medical aid to wounded on both sides, because the battle was over, and now they were dealing with prisoners who deserved to be treated according to the rules of war and not as enemies to be punished, and he made it clear that anyone who mistreated Kralthan prisoners would face court-martial, because humanity would win the peace as well as the war. Human Marines boarded the Decimator and found Warlord Vakris standing in the center of his ruined bridge with his arms crossed and his head held high, and he refused to show weakness even in defeat, and the Marines treated him with professional courtesy as they placed restraints on his wrists and escorted him to a shuttle that would take him to the Liberty, and eventually to Earth, where he would face trial for the crimes committed during his conquest. Captain Morrison and his team emerged from the mountains of Riverside, and when they arrived at the governor's mansion, they found human forces already securing the area, and Morrison was met by a colonel who saluted him and said that Admiral Hayes wanted to speak with him personally, and Morrison felt uncomfortable because he was just a captain who had done what needed to be done, and he did not think he deserved special recognition for surviving and fighting back. But Hayes insisted, and when Morrison was brought aboard the Liberty and stood before the admiral, he was told that his guerrilla operations and intelligence gathering had been crucial to the success of Operation Hammer, and the computer virus he had uploaded had disrupted Kralthan coordination at exactly the right moment, and Hayes said that Morrison would be recommended for the Star of Valor, which was the highest military honor humanity could award. Morrison accepted the praise, but he asked Hayes about the colonists who had died while the human fleet waited and prepared, and he wanted to know if those deaths had been necessary. And Hayes looked at him with eyes that showed the weight of command, and he said that every death in war was a tragedy, but sometimes the only way to save millions was to sacrifice thousands, and it was a burden that commanders carried for the rest of their lives. The liberation of occupied colonies began immediately, and human forces moved from world to world, freeing populations that had been living under Kralthan rule for weeks. And everywhere they went, they found Kralthan troops who surrendered quickly, Once they learned their fleet was destroyed and their warlord was captured, and without leadership or support, the occupation forces collapsed like houses built on sand. New Haven was one of the first colonies liberated, and when human ships arrived in orbit, the remaining Kralthan forces laid down their weapons without resistance, and Morrison returned to the world he had defended and fled and fought for, and he walked through the ruins of cities that had been beautiful before the war, and saw the faces of colonists who had survived, and he felt anger and sadness in equal measure. On Earth, President Carter addressed the human population, and she announced that the Kralthan invasion had been defeated, and their fleet destroyed, and their warlord captured, and the occupied colonies were being liberated, and she praised the courage of those who had fought and the patience of those who had waited, and she said that humanity had proven it could defend itself against any threat but would always prefer peace to war. The speech was met with celebrations across human space, and people poured into streets on Earth and Mars and Europa and the colonies that had remained free, and they cheered and cried and held each other, because the fear that had gripped them for weeks was finally gone, and they could believe again in a future that did not include enslavement or death. But not everyone celebrated, because the families of those who died in the occupied colonies felt anger at a government that had seemed to abandon them, and protests erupted demanding answers about why the fleet had not responded sooner and why so many had been sacrificed for a military strategy. And Carter knew these questions would be asked, and she had no easy answers because the truth was complex and painful. Admiral Hayes met with Warlord Vakris in a holding cell on the Liberty, and the two military leaders sat across from each other, separated by a force field, and Hayes wanted to understand how an intelligent commander could make such catastrophic errors in judgment, and Vakris wanted to understand how a primitive species had managed to deceive and defeat the mighty Kralthan Empire. Hayes explained that humanity had detected the Kralthan expansion 3 years earlier and recognized that a conflict was inevitable, and instead of trying to match Kralthan military might directly, the humans had studied every battle the Kralthans fought and analyzed every tactic they used and identified patterns in how they conquered other species. And then humans had built a fleet specifically designed to counter those tactics. Vakris asked why the human fleet had not engaged earlier when they could have saved more colonies, and Hayes said that the Kralthans needed to believe they were winning easily, or they would have adapted their tactics and spread their forces too wide to trap effectively, and the only way to make Vakris confident enough to concentrate his fleet was to appear weak and frightened and defeated. The warlord listened, and his mandibles clicked slowly as he processed the information, and he said that humans had sacrificed their own people as bait in a trap, and Hayes said yes, that was exactly what they had done, and it was a decision that haunted him, but the alternative was a long war of attrition that humanity would likely lose, and sometimes the only moral choice was the lesser of two evils. Vakris asked what would happen to him, and Hayes said he would stand trial for war crimes and the colonies he had attacked deserved justice, and if found guilty, he would be punished according to human law. And Vakris nodded slowly and said that at least humans followed laws even for their enemies, and that was more than the Kralthan Empire had ever done for those it conquered. The Kralthan government reached out to humanity with requests for peace negotiations, and they said that Vakris had acted without proper authorization, and his conquest was not supported by the Kralthan High Council, and humanity should not judge the entire empire by the actions of one rogue warlord. And Hayes read these diplomatic messages and laughed bitterly, because everyone knew that Vakris had been fully supported until the moment he lost. President Carter decided to accept the peace overtures because continuing the war would require invading Kralthan space, and humanity had no desire to become conquerors, and besides, the point had been made that attacking humanity was a mistake, and other species in the region would learn from what happened to Vakris and his fleet. The peace negotiations took weeks and resulted in a treaty that required the Kralthan Empire to withdraw from all occupied territories and pay reparations to affected colonies and establish formal diplomatic relations with humanity. And in exchange, humans agreed not to pursue military action against Kralthan core worlds, and both sides would respect each other's borders and work together on mutual security concerns. Some humans felt the treaty was too lenient and wanted revenge for the colonies that had suffered. But Carter explained that peace was not about revenge but about creating a stable future, and humanity had proven its strength and now needed to prove its wisdom and the ability to win wars without becoming the kind of empire it had just defeated. Captain Morrison returned to New Haven and found his home destroyed, and his city in ruins, and reconstruction had already begun. But it would take years to rebuild what had been lost in days, and he walked through streets where he had grown up and seen friends die, and he wondered if the victory had been worth the cost, and he had no easy answer. But then he saw children playing in the rubble and families working together to clear debris and rebuild homes, and people helping each other without being asked, because that was what humans did when facing hardship. And Morrison realized that the Krauthans had destroyed buildings and killed people, but they had not destroyed the human spirit, and that spirit was what would rebuild the colonies stronger than before. Admiral Hayes stood before the assembled military leadership and government officials, and he gave a speech that would be studied in military academies for generations, and he said that humanity had won not because of superior weapons or greater numbers, but because they had refused to fight the war their enemy wanted to fight, and instead they had created a new kind of war that played to human strengths. He explained that the Krauthan Empire had conquered other species by using overwhelming force to break their will quickly, and then occupying their worlds before organized resistance could form. And that strategy had worked 17 times and would have worked again if humanity had tried to fight conventionally. But humans had recognized the pattern and developed a counter-strategy that turned Krauthan strengths into weaknesses. Hayes said that the key lesson was to never underestimate an enemy, but also never let an enemy fully understand your capabilities until the trial of Warlord Vakris began 6 months after the Battle of Riverside, and it was held in The Hague on Earth, in a courtroom built specifically for interstellar war crimes, and representatives from 12 different species attended as observers, because the galaxy was watching to see how humanity would treat a defeated enemy, and whether human justice was fair or merely revenge dressed in legal robes. Vakris stood before the court in simple prison clothing without his armor or weapons or any symbol of his former rank, and he listened as prosecutors detailed the crimes committed during his conquest of human colonies, and the evidence included testimony from survivors and recordings from Krauthan military communications, and data recovered from captured ships, and the case against him was overwhelming and irrefutable. The warlord was charged with ordering attacks on civilian populations and refusing to accept surrenders and destroying colonies that had offered no military resistance, and each charge carried potential sentences that added up to multiple lifetimes in prison, and the prosecutors asked for the maximum penalty under human law because the crimes were severe and the victims deserved justice. But Vakris' defense attorney argued that the warlord had been following the established practices of the Krauthan Empire, and that he had never been taught that such practices were illegal under interstellar law, and that punishing him for following his culture's military traditions was unfair, and the attorney asked for leniency based on cultural differences and lack of intent to commit crimes. Admiral Hayes was called to testify, and he sat in the witness stand and answered questions about the military campaign and the human response. And when asked if he thought Vakris should be punished, Hayes said that ignorance of law was not an excuse for breaking it, and that every sentient being understood the difference between military necessity and cruelty. And Vakris had chosen cruelty when other options existed. The trial lasted 3 weeks, and the court heard from dozens of witnesses, including Captain Morrison, who described finding bodies of civilians who had been killed after they surrendered, and colonists who had lost families to Krauthan bombardments, and Krauthan officers who testified that Vakris had personally ordered attacks that served no military purpose, but were meant to break human morale through terror. When it was his turn to speak, Vakris stood before the court, and he said that he regretted nothing because he had served his empire faithfully and followed orders and done what was necessary to achieve victory, and he said that humanity had only won through deception and trickery, and if given another chance he would fight the same war the same way, and the courtroom fell silent because his complete lack of remorse made the decision easier for the judges. The verdict came after 2 days of deliberation, and Vakris was found guilty on all charges and sentenced to 40 years in prison with possibility of parole after 25 years if he showed genuine remorse and understanding of his crimes and accepted responsibility for the suffering he had caused. And many people thought the sentence was too lenient. But President Carter said that justice was not about satisfying bloodlust, but about upholding principles. The Krauthan Empire accepted the verdict and agreed to honor the sentence, and they formally apologized to humanity for the invasion and acknowledged that their military practices violated accepted standards of interstellar conduct, and they promised to reform their approach to conflict and join the galactic community as peaceful partners rather than conquerors. And some believed the apology was sincere, and others thought it was political necessity. On New Haven, Captain Morrison watched as construction crews worked to rebuild his city, and the work was slow but steady, and colonists had returned from refugee camps and were reclaiming their homes and lives, and Morrison had been promoted to major and given command of the colonial defense forces, and he took his new responsibilities seriously, because he never wanted New Haven to be unprepared again. A young girl approached Morrison one day while he was supervising reconstruction, and she was maybe 8 years old with large eyes that had seen too much, and she asked if the bad aliens would come back, and Morrison knelt down to her level, and he told her that humans had shown the galaxy that attacking them was a mistake, and other species would remember that lesson. But he also said that the best way to prevent future wars was to stay strong and vigilant. The girl asked if Morrison was a hero, and he smiled sadly and said that heroes were people who had no other choice but to do the right thing, and all he had done was refuse to give up, when giving up would have been easier, and the real heroes were the colonists who survived and rebuilt and chose hope over despair. And the girl hugged him and ran off to play, and Morrison watched her go, and felt something like peace for the first time since the war began. Admiral Hayes retired from active military service 1 year after the Battle of Riverside, and President Carter awarded him the Presidential Medal of Honor in a ceremony attended by thousands. And Hayes gave a short speech where he thanked his crew and officers and said that victories belonged to the people who fought, not the commanders who planned. And he dedicated his medal to the colonists who had died while the fleet prepared its trap. In his retirement, Hayes became an advisor to the military academy, and he taught strategy and tactics to young officers, and he always emphasized the importance of thinking 3 steps ahead and understanding your enemy better than they understood themselves, and never fighting fair when fighting smart was an option. And his students called him the man who saved humanity, and he told them that humanity had saved itself by refusing to give up. Commander Lisa Grant took over Hayes' position as fleet commander, and she immediately began implementing lessons learned from the Krain War, and she expanded intelligence gathering operations and invested in new technologies and created rapid response forces that could deploy to any threatened colony within days. And under her leadership, the human fleet became one of the most respected military forces in the region. The human government established the Colonial Defense Initiative, which provided funding and training to every human world so they could defend themselves until the fleet arrived, and the initiative included early warning systems and fortified shelters and militia training programs, and the goal was to ensure that no colony would ever be as unprepared as New Haven had been when Vacris attacked. Other species in the galaxy took notice of humanity's victory, and some reached out with offers of alliance and trade and mutual defense agreements, and humanity found itself suddenly important in galactic politics, and President Carter navigated these new relationships carefully, because she knew that today's ally could become tomorrow's enemy, and trust had to be earned over time. The Krain Empire underwent massive reforms after their defeat, and their High Council removed the military leaders who had supported Vacris, and installed new leaders who favored diplomacy over conquest, and they reached out to species they had conquered and offered reparations and apologies, and slowly rebuilt their reputation from feared aggressors to cautious partners. Captain Jake Morrison received a visit from a Krain diplomat 2 years after the war, and the diplomat was young and earnest and said that the Krain people wanted to understand how they had been so wrong about humanity, and Morrison told the story of the resistance in the guerrilla war and the moment when human ships had appeared in the sky, and the diplomat listened carefully and took notes and thanked Morrison for his honesty. The diplomat asked if Morrison hated the Krain people, and Morrison thought about the question for a long time before answering, and he said that he hated what had been done to his colony and his people, but he understood that soldiers followed orders, and most Krain warriors were just serving their empire the way he served humanity. And hate was easy, but understanding was harder and more important. New Haven held a memorial ceremony on the 3rd anniversary of the invasion, and thousands gathered to remember those who had died, and Morrison gave a speech where he listed names of civilians and soldiers who had given their lives, and he said that the best way to honor them was to build a future worthy of their sacrifice, and to never forget that freedom required eternal vigilance and sacrifice. Admiral Hayes visited Vacris in prison 5 years after the trial, and the 2 former enemies sat across from each other in a visiting room, And Hayes asked if the Warlord had learned anything from his time in confinement, and Vakris said that he had learned humans were more dangerous than any species he had fought, because they thought differently and valued different things and refused to follow predictable patterns. Hayes asked if Vakris felt remorse for the people who died, and Vakris was quiet for a long time. And then he said that remorse was a human concept that did not translate well to Kralthan psychology, but he understood that his actions had caused suffering, and if given the chance he would make different choices because losing hurt more than he had imagined possible. And that pain taught him lessons that victory never could. The galaxy settled into a new normal, where humanity was recognized as a major power, and the Kralthan Empire was rehabilitating its image, and dozens of smaller species formed alliances based on mutual defense against potential aggressors, and the era of easy conquests was over, because everyone had learned from humanity's example that preparation